Good morning/afternoon/evening, everyone. Today I invite you to step into a moment where politics, power, and principles collide on the world stage. Picture this: the global order is shifting, alliances are being tested, and voices of leadership are echoing across nations. In the midst of this, India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, sends a message that doesn't just challenge one leader, but shakes the very foundation of international relations. His words to Donald Trump weren't merely about diplomacy, they were a wake-up call to the world. Multilateralism, the very spirit of global cooperation, is under attack, and in that bold declaration lies a lesson not just for governments, but for all of us about courage, clarity, and standing firm when the stakes are high. Multilateralism under threat is one of the defining realities of our world today. For decades, nations have relied on global institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and international agreements on climate and security to create balance and cooperation. The very idea of multilateralism rests on the principle that global challenges cannot be solved by one country alone, no matter how powerful. Instead, countries come together, share responsibility, and find common ground for the greater good of humanity. But in recent years, this foundation has been weakening. Increasing nationalism, protectionist policies, and power rivalries are slowly chipping away at the trust and unity that multilateral systems once promised. The clearest sign of this erosion is visible in the way powerful nations are beginning to bypass or even openly undermine global institutions. For example, trade disputes are often settled through unilateral tariffs instead of through the World Trade Organization. Similarly, when it comes to climate change, instead of binding agreements being respected, many governments backtrack on commitments when domestic pressures arise. This creates an imbalance. Smaller nations that depend on rules-based systems to ensure fairness are left vulnerable, while stronger nations act according to their own interests. In this sense, the attack on multilateralism is not physical, but ideological. It is the slow sidelining of cooperative values in favor of dominance and self-prioritization. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a striking example of how multilateralism faltered under stress. Rather than collaborating effectively through institutions like the World Health Organization, many countries retreated into a mindset of self-preservation, competing for vaccines, medical supplies, and even blocking exports to others. Instead of pooling resources and expertise, the pandemic response became fragmented, leaving weaker nations to struggle. The absence of unity during such a global crisis highlighted just how fragile multilateral systems have become and how urgently they need revival. At the same time, the rise of nationalism and populist leadership has accelerated this decline. Leaders who prioritize "my country first" often dismiss the idea of global obligations. While such policies may win domestic applause, they damage long-term international cooperation. The more countries retreat into narrow self-interest, the less effective multilateral frameworks become. This is particularly dangerous in today's interconnected world, where challenges like climate change, terrorism, pandemics, and cyber threats cannot be confined within borders. If cooperation collapses, every nation stands to lose, regardless of size or power. India's Minister of External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar, highlighted this problem when he emphasized that multilateralism is under attack. His message was not just a critique of one leader or one nation, but a reminder that the entire global order is at stake. Without strong multilateral cooperation, the world risks sliding back into an era where might is right, where rules are ignored, and where only the strongest set the agenda. This is why defending multilateralism is more than a diplomatic choice. It is a necessity for peace, stability, and fairness in international relations. Dr. S. Jaishankar's bold stance in global diplomacy has become a defining aspect of India's voice on the world stage. Unlike many leaders who rely on soft and cautious language, Jaishankar speaks with clarity, confidence, and conviction, his approach reflects not just the perspective of one nation, but the rising sentiment of many countries in the global south that feel sidelined by dominant powers. When he challenges ideas of unilateralism, he is essentially saying that the world can no longer be dictated by a few powerful states, and that every country, regardless of size, deserves respect and a seat at the table. This assertiveness is what makes his stance bold. It is not aggression, but a fearless call for equality and fairness in international relations. Jaishankar has often been described as a diplomat who combines deep knowledge with sharp articulation. In his speeches, he does not shy away from pointing out global hypocrisies. For example, when developed nations demand strict climate commitments from emerging economies but fail to honor their own responsibilities, he calls out the imbalance. Similarly, when certain nations use international laws selectively, he reminds the world that rules must apply universally. By doing this, he is not just defending India's interests, but reinforcing the principle that global order must be fair and consistent. His boldness lies in refusing to accept double standards, and in daring to say what many leaders hesitate to voice publicly. This stance has significant implications for India's position in global affairs. Traditionally, India's diplomacy was seen as careful and somewhat defensive, avoiding direct confrontation with major powers. But Jaishankar's approach signals a new era, one where India is ready to engage as an equal, not as a passive participant. By speaking confidently to leaders like Donald Trump or representatives of the European Union, he demonstrates that India will not be pressured into silence or compromise when its principles are at stake. Instead, he positions India as a responsible, independent, and courageous voice that reflects the aspirations of a wider community of nations. His boldness also comes from the way he frames India's role in global challenges. On issues such as multilateralism, climate change, and international trade, he emphasizes that India is not only a stakeholder, but a contributor. He highlights how India provides vaccines, supports peacekeeping, and advances technology for development, thereby proving that the country has earned the right to speak strongly on fairness and equality. This makes his words more than rhetoric. They are backed by action and credibility. When Jaishankar insists that multilateralism must be protected, he is showing the world that India practices what it preaches. Ultimately, Jaishankar's bold stance is about shaping the narrative of global politics. For too long, smaller nations have felt that their voices are drowned out by the influence of great powers. By asserting India's position with courage, he gives strength to the idea that international cooperation should not be dominated by a select few. His message resonates beyond India's borders, reminding the world that true leadership is not about imposing will, but about standing firm on principles that safeguard justice and equality for all nations. When Dr. S. Jaishankar delivered his message to Donald Trump, it was more than a diplomatic remark. It was a statement to the world that unilateralism cannot dictate the future of international relations. Unilateralism is the idea that a powerful nation can act on its own, make decisions without consultation, and expect others to fall in line. This approach might seem effective in the short term for a dominant country, but it undermines trust, cooperation, and fairness in the global system. Jaishankar's message challenged this mindset directly, reminding the world that no single leader or nation has the right to shape global outcomes without considering the voices of others. The significance of his stance lies in the timing. At a moment when the United States under Trump was openly questioning multilateral agreements from climate accords to trade rules, many nations were hesitant to confront such a powerful figure. Yet Jaishankar spoke with firmness, not out of hostility, but out of conviction that the rules-based order must be preserved. His statement to Trump symbolized a broader resistance to the idea that strength alone can justify unilateral action. By making this point, He gave courage to other nations that felt the same, but lacked the platform or influence to say it aloud. What made his message particularly impactful was that it did not come from a small or weak country pleading for attention, but from India, a rising global power with growing economic and strategic weight. This shifted the narrative. India was no longer a silent observer, but a strong voice standing up for principles of fairness. Jaishankar reminded the world that while the United States might have influence, it could not impose its will without resistance. His tone was measured but firm, embodying the confidence of a nation that seeks partnership, not subordination. The message also carried moral weight. In international politics, unilateral actions often create ripple effects that harm weaker nations. For example, when tariffs are imposed or agreements are abandoned, it is usually smaller economies that pay the highest price. By insisting that unilateralism cannot dictate the world, Jaishankar was advocating not just for India's interests, but for all nations that depend on stable, predictable rules to survive and thrive. His voice became a reminder that the international community should be guided by shared responsibility, not by the ambitions of a few. This stance highlighted a deeper truth about leadership. Real strength lies in building consensus, not enforcing compliance. Jaishankar's words challenged the notion of power as domination and reframed it as responsibility. By addressing Trump's approach, he demonstrated that diplomacy must be about dialogue and cooperation, not threats and ultimatums. This perspective resonated globally, especially among countries that felt increasingly sidelined in a world drifting toward power politics. In essence, Jaishankar's message was a call to restore balance. It warned that if unilateralism becomes the norm, global institutions will lose credibility, alliances will fracture, and peace will be harder to maintain. By daring to confront this truth, even in front of a figure as influential as Donald Trump, Jaishankar showcased India's determination to defend the principles of equality and shared decision-making. His words remain a powerful reminder that the world belongs to all, not to one. The rise of the Global South is one of the most important shifts in international politics today, and it is changing how power and influence are distributed in the world. For decades, global decision-making was dominated by Western powers and a handful of developed nations. They set the agenda, created the rules, and expected others to follow. But in recent years, emerging economies across Asia, Africa, and Latin America have begun to assert themselves with greater confidence. These countries, often grouped together as the Global South, are demanding not just recognition, but also fair space in shaping the world order. This is not merely a call for inclusion. It is a statement that the balance of power is no longer what it used to be. One of the main drivers of this rise is economic growth. Nations like India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, and many others have significantly expanded their economies, lifted millions out of poverty, and developed technological and industrial capacities. This has given them both credibility and leverage in international negotiations. For example, India's role in the digital economy, clean energy, and vaccine production shows that it is not a passive recipient of global aid, but a proactive contributor to global solutions. Similarly, African nations, with their young populations and resource potential, are increasingly central to discussions about energy security, climate change, and sustainable development. These transformations make it impossible to ignore the Global South's role in global decision-making. Another factor driving this shift is unity through forums and alliances. Organizations such as BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the African Union, and the G77 are platforms where the Global South can collectively voice its concerns. These groups push back against the dominance of a few nations and demand reforms in institutions like the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund, which often reflect outdated power structures. For instance, the call for a permanent seat for India or Africa in the UN Security Council is not just symbolic. It reflects the reality that these regions represent billions of people whose voices must be heard. The rise of the Global South also represents a new narrative about fairness and justice. These countries argue that they should not be forced to carry burdens that were largely created by developed nations. Climate change is a prime example. While the Global South suffers the harshest consequences, it contributed far less to the crisis compared to industrialized countries. This demand for climate justice highlights the broader struggle, the need for rules that reflect shared responsibilities, not historical privileges. Jaishankar and other leaders often emphasize this point, showing that the South will no longer accept one-sided rules imposed from the North. At its core, the rise of the Global South is not about confrontation, but about balance. These nations are not rejecting cooperation with the West. Rather, they are insisting that cooperation must be equal. They are ready to contribute to global solutions, but they want their voices respected and their interests protected. This movement is reshaping the very foundation of global politics, proving that the world is no longer unipolar or bipolar, but multipolar. The message is clear: the future of international relations cannot be written without the active participation of the Global South. The United Nations stands today at a critical crossroads, facing questions about its effectiveness, relevance, and ability to respond to modern challenges. When it was established in 1945, the UN symbolized hope for a world shattered by war. It was built on the promise of collective security, cooperation, and fairness. For decades, it has provided a platform for dialogue and prevented conflicts from escalating into global wars. Yet, over time, the limitations of the institution have become more apparent. The structures and rules that once worked in the mid-20th century no longer reflect the realities of the 21st. As new powers rise and global problems become more complex, the UN is struggling to keep pace, creating a crisis of confidence in its role. One of the most pressing criticisms is the composition of the Security Council. The 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, still hold the same level of influence they had at the end of World War II. Meanwhile, regions like Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, which represent billions of people, have no permanent representation. This imbalance makes the Council appear outdated and unfair. It also weakens the legitimacy of its decisions, since they often reflect the interests of the few rather than the many. Calls for reform, including the addition of countries like India, Brazil, and an African representative, have been made repeatedly, but resistance from existing powers has stalled progress. Beyond representation, the UN also struggles with effectiveness. Peacekeeping missions, once seen as symbols of international solidarity, often lack resources and face political constraints. In conflicts like Syria or Ukraine, the UN has been unable to act decisively due to vetoes in the Security Council. This paralyzes the organization and exposes its inability to respond to urgent crises. The very tool that was meant to prevent unilateral actions, the veto, is now being used as a shield by powerful states to protect their interests, undermining the credibility of multilateralism. The UN challenges also extend to global issues beyond conflict. Climate change, cybersecurity, pandemics, and economic inequality require coordinated responses. While the UN provides frameworks such as the Paris Agreement or the Sustainable Development Goals, implementation remains weak. Member states often prioritize domestic agendas over global commitments, leaving the UN unable to enforce accountability. This inconsistency feeds the perception that the organization is more of a discussion forum than a driver of real change. Yet, despite its flaws, the UN remains indispensable. It is the only platform where nearly every nation has a voice, no matter how small. Its agencies, from UNICEF to the World Health Organization, play vital roles in humanitarian aid, development, and global health. The problem is not its existence, but its structure and political will. Reform is not a choice anymore, it is a necessity. If the UN fails to evolve, it risks becoming irrelevant in a world where nations might bypass it entirely and resort to regional or unilateral solutions. At this crossroads, the future of the UN depends on whether countries are willing to make it more inclusive, effective, and accountable. The world cannot afford an institution that is symbolic but powerless. A reformed UN could once again be the cornerstone of global cooperation, but without change, it risks losing the trust of the very nations it was created to serve. The call for unity has never been more urgent than it is today. The challenges confronting the world, climate change, pandemics, terrorism, economic instability, cyber threats, and geopolitical rivalries, are problems too vast for any single nation to solve alone. Yet the reality of our time is that divisions are widening instead of narrowing. Nationalism, protectionism, and power struggles often overshadow the need for cooperation. In this environment, the message that only collective action can safeguard peace is both a warning and a reminder of what is truly at stake. Without unity, the world risks fragmenting into blocs, conflicts, and crises that could spiral out of control. Unity does not mean uniformity. It does not require nations to abandon their identities, interests, or sovereignty. Instead, it means recognizing that survival and progress depend on shared responsibility. Climate change offers a clear example. Rising temperatures, melting glaciers, and extreme weather events do not respect borders. A storm that begins in one part of the world can devastate another thousands of miles away. Unless all nations act together to reduce emissions and transition to sustainable practices, no single country's effort will be enough. The same is true for pandemics, where the spread of disease from one region can rapidly become a global emergency. These challenges highlight that unity is not an abstract ideal, but a practical necessity. History has shown the power of collective action. Institutions like the United Nations, despite their flaws, were created on the belief that peace and cooperation are stronger than division and conflict. Multilateral agreements, such as those on nuclear disarmament or international trade, have prevented countless disputes from escalating. Even during moments of deep rivalry, nations have managed to collaborate on issues like space exploration or disease eradication. These successes prove that when the world comes together, remarkable progress is possible. The question now is whether nations can find the will to prioritize unity over short-term gains and political rivalries. Leaders like Dr. S. Jaishankar stress unity not only because it protects peace, but also because it empowers fairness. Smaller nations, when acting alone, often struggle to make their voices heard. But when they stand in solidarity with others, their influence multiplies. This is why coalitions of developing countries, whether in trade negotiations or climate talks, have been able to push back against the dominance of wealthier states. Unity gives strength to the weak, balance to the strong, and stability to the global system. The greatest obstacle to unity is mistrust. Nations hesitate to cooperate when they fear exploitation or inequality. Overcoming this requires transparency, fairness, and respect. If global governance systems are reformed to reflect today's realities, where all nations are given an equal chance to participate, then trust can be rebuilt. Once trust is restored, unity becomes not just possible, but natural. In the end, the call for unity is a call for survival. A divided world will only multiply crises, while a united one can transform challenges into opportunities. Collective action is the only safeguard for peace, justice, and progress. The future of humanity depends on whether we choose cooperation over conflict, solidarity over division, and unity over isolation.